Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pre-Diet Podcast. I am your host, Allie Virtue. I'm a functional medicine nutritionist, and this podcast is all about giving you some tools, teaching you about nutrition, talking to different professionals, all in an effort to help you truly become the healthier version of you, doing this whole nutrition health thing in a really positive way, and so much so you don't feel the need to start another random diet on Monday. We want to get ahead of that, and we want to make sure that this is the last time you feel like you need to, quote, restart or something like that. And today's episode is a fantastic one. We are talking with Mariah Sede, and she is a licensed professional counselor, mental health counselor, and she is phenomenal. This is actually the second time we recorded this particular episode because the first time we had such terrible technical issues, and so hopefully today that is all fine. Please excuse our little bit of scratchy throats because we were both dealing with allergies, but we made it work, and I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. If you are someone who has wanted to be a healthier version of yourself, but maybe had a little bit of a complicated history with food, whether that's on the spectrum of restricting or overeating, binge eating, things like that, if it's just been complicated for you, she gives you so many tools and so many avenues to help you with that, how to get started with seeking other more professional help. It's just, I felt like this conversation was just honestly like a warm hug. All right, so Mariah helps people heal from a variety of issues such as trauma, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, disordered eating, relationship issues, and more. She is a licensed professional counselor in Idaho and Oregon with a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from Corbin University. Her professional background includes diverse clinical and leadership roles, serving individuals, families, and communities with complex mental health needs. She works with people 14 years old or older, all via telehealth, with an in-person services clinic coming soon to the Yamhill County in Oregon. She uses treatment therapies like CBT, person-centered therapy, and body-based work through somatic approaches, food, exercise, herbs, and supplementation to expedite the healing process. She specializes in culturally and linguistically specific services provider to the Latina community. She talks more about what makes her practice so unique, and it was just, again, if you're listening to this podcast, you're gonna want to listen all the way to the end to hear more about how her approach is unique. But let's dive into the episode. Well, hi Mariah, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Pre-Diet Podcast for the second time. This is a re-recording for those that are listening because we tried to do this the first time, had some severe technical issues, but I think we've got that all figured out. But welcome to the show, and thank you so much for making the time to chat with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I just did a little bit of an introduction, but tell us a little bit more about who you are as a person, how you found counseling, just a little background info so we can get to know you a little bit better.
So my name is Mariah Sede. I'm one of the owners of Sede Counseling. And I found myself in counseling because I was kind of that person that everyone went to when they needed to talk, when they were going through a hard time, they needed advice, and I found that just through having conversation, people felt better, they were able to make decisions, move forward, and so I was like, wow, this is really fulfilling to be able to help people in this way. And then I discovered that I could make a career out of that, and so I went to school and studied it, and here I am.
Amazing. How long have you been a counselor for?
I graduated about 2 years ago.
And your practice is pretty unique. You get to work with your partner, right? Is he also a counselor, different specialties, or?
Yeah. He's also a therapist. We went to school together. We met in undergrad, and then we did the grad program together.
Now, we know each other through doing a mutual project in Salem. I think it was at a golf course, like Wellness Talk. And I loved your topic because you have a specific passion for helping people with eating disorders. Can you talk a little bit more about that and explain like kind of the spectrum? Because I think people have sometimes a misconception of like, what is an eating disorder? They can look so different.
Yeah, absolutely. I do really love working with disordered eating, and there are a variety of different types of disordered eating. The most common types are anorexia nervosa, which can have subtypes as well. It can also include binge eating. It can include purging. It can include over-exercise. And I think an interesting note on purging too is that people most often think of vomiting as purging, but also the use of laxatives is another way that people try to avoid calorie absorption. And then there's binge eating. And so those two, anorexia nervosa with its various subtypes, and then binge eating, are, I think, the most widely talked about and the most widely seen. But there are others as well, like, food avoidance, which can happen for a variety of reasons. But the difference there is that it's not focused on body image compared to anorexia nervosa. And then there are others like rumination disorder, pica, lots of different types.
And I think one of the statistics you shared with me the first time was that eating disorders have the second highest mortality rate among mental health disorders, second only to addictions. That I felt like hit me like a ton of bricks. And we've heard about it, but I never thought it was that common.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that it's that lethal too, because it's something that can just really get out of hand, and it leads to starvation. Um, is why that is so high. Other health complications with the binge eating, with excessive weight. And then also, unfortunately, people get so desperate that they resort to suicide too. And so it's really a combination of things, but absolutely, it does have a very high mortality rate, and is a major problem in our society for sure.
Can you explain the specifics of maybe if we pick those two main types of anorexia nervosa and maybe binge eating or bulimia? Because I think a lot of people will be surprised. I hear it a lot of like, oh, I just overeat. And then when we start working on the nutrition side, they start to realize like, oh, I overeat every night or multiple times a week to the point of, severe discomfort type of thing. But are there significant cutoffs as far as like maybe a diagnosis, but very specific things of like, oh, maybe I actually am more on that spectrum than I thought versus just having, a couple bad habits or something like that?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to binge eating disorder, it more or less boils down to how much control you have over it. So if the individual is overeating, at birthday parties and Thanksgiving, but they're fine every other time of the year, or, they just really like their sweet treat at night, but otherwise they don't really struggle with food, then that person's fine. They're not going to meet,
Mm-hmm.
the criteria for binge eating. But if you have an individual who, once they get started, they feel like they can't stop, that's a really good indication. If you have an individual who starts hiding their food intake, so they go and they eat in secret because they're embarrassed or ashamed of how much food they're taking in, if they are eating their food very, very rapidly, they're not even stopping to like taste their food and feel the textures. If they feel like the food controls them as opposed to them having control over what they eat, those are all really good indications that that person may meet criteria for binge eating disorder.
What would be the first step if someone's like, oh, okay, that's maybe I am closer to those diagnosis parameters than I thought? What would be like the first step? Is that reaching out to a counselor, their PCP? How does that kind of start for someone who's curious where they're at?
Yeah, well, I never ever want to discourage anyone from reaching out to their PCP. Absolutely. That's a great thing to do to see, like, how are your eating habits affecting you, whether or not you meet criteria. It's awesome to get labs done, see where you're at nutritionally, see where you're at in terms of your weight. With that said, in terms of determining whether or not you meet criteria for an eating disorder, you're probably going to get referred to a counselor. And so if you're wanting to determine whether or not you meet criteria, that's where you would go. And then of course to get treatment for that. So both are excellent options. Great places to start.
Awesome. Because I think there's a little bit of a misconception of this is just, I hear it all the time, but people will say like, oh, I know what to do, I'm just not doing it yet. And they kind of leave it there. But it's not necessarily a lack of discipline. Can you talk about some of the impacts that might have happened in someone's life that lands them in this situation where they might be dealing with an eating disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is where the restrictive types versus the binge eating really kind of differ. And then you have the really interesting combination of anorexia nervosa with the binge eating subtype, right? And we can get into that. But when we're looking at binge eating, that is primarily an individual who never learned how to um, process their emotions and effectively cope with them. And so food is being used as a coping skill, and as a way of self-soothing. And then it gets out of hand, and then it's sort of a self-fulfilling, it's like a cycle that just feeds itself because the individual binges, they feel ashamed of the binge. And then what do when they feel ashamed? They need something to self soothe, so they turn to more food, and on it goes. Um, and there are various things that can lead a person to such overwhelm that they are coping in this way, in addition to not having other coping skills. Things like trauma, things like really difficult relational dynamics that are causing a lot of stress. Um, work stress, various things can lead a person there, but really the lack of coping skills is what causes them to engage in that specific behavior. Um, when we look at anorexia nervosa, that is a little different in that it focuses on control. And that control issue stems from a place of disempowerment. And that can come from a variety of things. That can come from trauma, which can feel really disempowering. It can come from oppression within society, oppression of women, oppression of minorities, um, individuals who suffer from both. It can stem from, oppressive kind of religious communities. It can come from family dynamics that feel very limiting and oppressive. And an individual struggling with all these things, they look for something that they can control. If they don't have any control in their home, they don't have any control in their workplace, they don't have any control in society, typically the easiest thing for an individual to control is their own body. And so then they start hyper controlling their body. But what's interesting is that control ends up being something that controls them. All of a sudden, they're controlled by food. They're controlled by the calories and the number on the scale and how many steps they've taken and on and on. And it just becomes one more thing that's oppressive in their life.
It makes me think of so many clients just over the last like 9 years. I don't think I've heard of it very commonly starting in teens, but that makes a lot of sense. Like as a teenager, when you're very much coming close to your adult years, but definitely not an adult yet. But that is something you can control, whether I eat dinner or not, how much of dinner I eat, or if I have money to go get something different for lunch, and taking those small kind of control where you can. That highlights that time. And when I've worked with clients who are in their early 20s, but parents are still heavily involved with regulating a lot of life, I can definitely see how attractive it might seem to someone in that situation to get hyper focused and hyper controlled on that aspect that they actually do have somewhat control over. That makes a lot of sense. So as someone who might be around someone that's dealing with that, what could that person do to help out? Because I see nurturing parents like wanting to help their kids out, but almost like in that scenario, right, they want to add more control potentially. What would you advise that parent or friend to help out someone in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say giving that individual as much autonomy as possible, empowering them to be able to make the healthy choices instead of making those choices for them. Um, Because you're absolutely right. Because this is such a lethal diagnosis, people panic and people start to do everything that they can just to get this person, especially with anorexia nervosa, to gain some weight. And unfortunately, the more that they try to control that person, oftentimes the worse it gets. And this happens with well-meaning parents all the time. And so empowering that individual to know what is healthy and what's not. Can you get them set up with a dietitian? Can you get them set up with a counselor who's going to non-judgmentally listen to them and just allow them to express their thoughts, their emotions, their perceptions, a place where they can just be and feel free to be who they are. I see a lot of times with teenagers who are wanting to individuate and also to gain more responsibility, which is totally natural in that season of their lives, they really struggle when they're not able to do those things. And so if they're wanting to get out there and get a job, totally support that if at all possible. If they're wanting to drive, support that as much as you can. Um, as much as they're able to go and um, gain responsibility, express their thoughts, express their opinions, their feelings, their perceptions, and grow into who they are as a separate person, the better off they're going to be.
That's such great advice, and something that's so like outside of food. I found that as well in general when clients do well, food is less important. And I think people are surprised that a nutritionist would say that. But I found that for my own self, like when I used to deal with probably on the spectrum of binge eating for sure, it definitely felt outside of my control. But then when life got way better than any food could taste, like food took a back seat. And I was like, oh wait, life is so cool. Like I want to go do this stuff. Like food is less important, less controlling, all of those things. But I was wondering because I don't have kids yet, but I always wonder, and I'm very conscious of how I talk to my clients, not just for them, but because they're likely going to be parroting things in front of their kids. And I'm obviously very, very passionate about not spreading or perpetuating any kind of disordered eating or talking about anything in that spectrum. How would you advise parents to talk about food with their kids? This comes up a lot too when they don't want to necessarily deprive the house of like sweets and stuff, but the parents are trying to limit that for themselves, but also semi for their kids, but they don't want to deprive them of stuff. I mean, I'm very conscious of saying, like it's not good or bad food. It's potentially like helpful or less helpful based on your goals or based on how you want to feel, things like that. But what are some things that you would help parents kind of give a healthier conversation around food and kids?
Yeah, I love what you just said there. It's not good or bad. That's a moral statement, which means, shame versus honor, right? If you eat the bad food, then you're bad and you should feel shame. And if you eat the good food, then you're good and you should feel honor, right? And that is not helpful. It's helpful food versus unhelpful food within the context, right? Because ice cream is helpful for celebrating, but ice cream is not helpful when you want, a nutritious dinner, right? So context matters, absolutely. And so staying neutral, and I think definitely modeling a healthy relationship with food. If you're super restrictive, your kid is going to pick up on that and they're going to be super restrictive. If you don't practice eating a healthy diet that includes a variety of nutrients, then your kid is also not going to practice that. And I think empowering your child with knowledge, what nutrients do these foods contain? What do those nutrients do? And why is that helpful to their growth and development and the health of their body? And then, giving their child as much freedom as possible when it comes to food and getting them involved in the process too. We find that kids because right, when we give freedom, we also want to make sure that we don't have a bunch of like really picky eaters who are then just going to eat goldfish and it's not going to be good for them. So if we get them involved in the food preparation process, typically kids who assist in that, they're less picky and they enjoy their meals more. And so involving them, educating them, giving them freedom and choice, staying neutral, and then, living that healthy lifestyle yourself as an example.
I love that. Okay, so to summarize, a variety of foods, which sounds great, just for like an interest, broad palette, exposing them to different things, and they can kind of make their choice if they want to, explore that food more or leave it. They don't love it at that moment. Involving them in the process. That came to mind when you're talking about independence, as far as like just supporting them and empowering them. And I know that was something that my parents started to teach me, probably also so I'd make my own breakfast, but like, hey, do you want to learn how to cook an egg? And like, you could do this by yourself. But that feels really empowering, and probably one thing less that the parent has to do. One thing I talked to a client recently about was kind of having that how to regulate sweets in the house type of thing, because mom definitely didn't want to be overly restricted, which I fully support, but also husband would like a little bit more help not having that stuff in an abundance. So we talked about having like a bin in the pantry of like, okay, this is where we put our sweet treats. You know, some stuff we really like, some stuff that's like okay, so it's not as like, I always compare everything to a carrot cake, because like you said, for my birthday, carrot cake is extremely helpful for celebrating. Right. On every day, less helpful also makes it less special. So I want to save it for like the days where it's really special. And it means more. If I had cake for breakfast, it would not mean very much. So we talked about that and a little bit of a discipline of like, we need to maybe finish the box of goodies that we picked out for ourselves before we go buy the stuff that I really like. So we, eat everything before kind of restocking. But I love that. That was so helpful. Did I miss anything? We talked about variety, getting people involved, teaching them about food, which I think is so missed, which is hard because I don't think I was really educated on food much in school or anything like that. It was really, really basic. But those are a great help. And hopefully that, generationally, we have less of a problem with these things.
Yeah, and I would really encourage parents to not feel intimidated either, because I think a lot of people, when they hear me say, oh, educate your kids about the nutrients in these foods and what that does in the body and how that's helpful for your health, I think a lot of people would say, well, I'm not really sure what, a carrot contains and how that's helpful for my body, right? And so I would just say, well, I know parents have so much on their plates, but this is good for you too. This is good for you to learn and for you to be empowered. And so when you're going to be involving your kid in making a dinner, maybe just do a quick Google search or even just ask ChatGPT because it's super quick. Yeah. These are the ingredients in the meal. What nutrients does it contain? How is this helpful for the body, right? And then share that with your child. You don't have to have a degree in this to be helpful and to educate yourself and others.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think it does a pretty good job, especially if you, at least I'm learning that with like AI and chat and stuff, if you ask a pretty neutral question versus like, tell me why gummy bears are bad for me, then you're going to get a whole list of things that make you think that they're going to kill you tomorrow versus like asking like a fairly neutral question of like, what is this about? A couple of the other things that came up on our first conversation is trying to find what a healthy coping mechanism is. Because you said it's different person to person, right? There could be someone who's over-exercising. But can you talk about how to maybe check in to see if you're coping well, if you've chosen good coping mechanisms, or if they're maybe not the best choice for your situation? Yeah.
I would say if your coping mechanism is not harmful to your health, it's not harmful to your relationships, you feel better afterwards, and it aligns with your moral compass, you have a pretty good coping skill. So that means that a lot of things are on the table. The most common ones are, breathing techniques, going for walks. Getting outside is so helpful, even on terribly rainy Oregon days like today, because when we see plants, just seeing a plant improves our mental health. Going for a walk, that is so good for our mental health. And the bilateral stimulation too, of like taking the steps with each foot, that helps us to process our emotions. And so if you're feeling down and you're pondering these things, you're going to have better integration if you're going for a walk. And that's actually how EMDR got started. The founder was like, well, why is it that I'm able to process my emotions so much better when I'm going for a walk as opposed to just sitting there? And that's when she started researching the bilateral stimulation, and we have EMDR today. So that's a great one.
What is EMDR? Stand for?
EMDR is, I'm not going to remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a tool for healing trauma. And there are different ways to get the bilateral stimulation. It was first done with someone would hold something and they'd move it back and forth and you'd track it with your eyes while you were talking. And that just was kind of exhausting for the patient and the therapist. And so we've come up with other methods like, handheld devices that vibrate. And so you'll get a vibration in one hand and then the other. And other methods might be like crossing your arms and then tapping. So lots of different methods, but that and processing trauma in a sequential way. There's a whole, I'm not certified in EMDR, but there's a whole sequence to it, to then process your trauma. And effectively, the more you do it, the more integrated it becomes in both sides of your brain, and the less potent the emotions feel.
It's so helpful. I love any like very practical of like, I feel this, like try this, or very like so we can actually envision kind of like the tools in my toolbox instead of sitting there like I'm stuck here. And I think a lot of times people talk about just, I mean, step one for any kind of behavior change is probably awareness, but any tools that help kind of allow us to have more awareness. Another thing you mentioned was, and this hit me really hard, I shared it with my husband right after we got off our first call, but just the talking about like labeling the feeling, but also like anxiety versus depression and how either superficial or like deep they feel. And just that distinction I felt was really helpful for me, because then I could kind of like, oh, this is anxiety, this is not as deep, I can manage this type of thing. But can you talk a little bit more about labeling things and how different they are, and what kind of tools we can utilize with different feelings?
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is like labeling the emotion to reduce the feeling. And then were you also talking about more surface level emotions versus core emotions?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So the first one, labeling your emotions, it's really interesting. Oftentimes we're not taught to attune to our own emotions. And that often is because we weren't attuned to super well, and so we didn't learn to do it ourselves. And so we'll dismiss, we'll ignore, we'll repress emotions. And when you start to feel some sort of way, sticking with it long enough to be able to put a label on it so that you know what it is actually reduces the feeling of that emotion. I'm talking about negative emotions here. Um, and that makes a lot of sense actually, because our emotions, they're trying to communicate something to us. So the amygdala, like in the last recording, I used this example of like a bear coming at you, and your amygdala is like lit up. That's your emotional center. It's telling you there's a threat, there's a threat, there's a threat. And once you are aware of that threat, you're able to do something about it and hopefully protect yourself. Um, and the same thing occurs with other types of threats, like, you just said something in a social setting that feels important to you, and now you have all this anxiety because it didn't land right. And so you have these emotions surfacing, and your body's trying to tell you there's a threat, there's a threat, there's a threat. You don't want to be, cut off from the tribe, so to speak, and socially isolated. And when you notice that and you label it, you're telling your nervous system, I'm aware of the threat, I'm going to deal with it. And another helpful coping skill we talked about last time related to this is when you don't have the time to process your emotions to completion in that moment, is having a designated time for processing emotions. And so in that moment, you can tell yourself, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling ashamed, or whatever it is. I'm going to deal with this at 6 p.m. tonight. And then you have your designated time, you stick to it, you always process your emotions during that time. Which brings us to processing emotions and what is the surface level emotion versus the core emotion. And so surface level emotions, they're emotions that often kind of come in to cover up, if you will, core emotions because they're easier to tolerate. And so anxiety, it can feel really unbearable, but it's sometimes even harder to feel things like terror, shame, rage. And so we feel anxious, but if we sit with it long enough and notice what comes up in our bodies, notice what thoughts are coming to our minds, noticing what it's connected to, and just keep feeling what emotions surface, you may find that you're feeling something deeper, and then you want to sit with that. How does that feel in your body? And what thoughts come to your mind, and how does the emotion ebb and flow and change? And as you continue noticing and sitting with the emotion and labeling it and connecting it to where it's coming from, you're processing that emotion. And when you get to a place of feeling clear mentally and calm emotionally, you know that you've processed that emotion to completion. And when I tell people about this, typically their reaction is, I don't think I've ever processed an emotion to completion in my life. And so that's why I'm telling you, so you can start processing your emotions to completion. Because when you do that, for those who are watching on video, this is something I tell my clients often. If this water bottle is you, and this water are your stressors, and, your boss tells you did a poor job on that last project, and then you come home and your spouse is upset with you, and now the baby's crying, and on and on and on, right? This water bottle is filling, it's going to overflow at some point unless you start scooping out that water or pouring off that water. And the way that you do that is by processing your emotions to completion.
That's so helpful. I mean, I think visuals are so helpful. But I think a lot of people wear that badge of honor of like, I'm resilient, I can handle it. But having the limited capacity, because we all, unpopular opinion, but like we have a limited capacity, even if we're just super tough. But that makes, because I think those people who say they're resilient would also say like, yes, sometimes it's like the person that wants to optimize everything, but that's a great, again, a literal tool that they can say, or kind of almost to bribe them of like, hey, let's process things now before you reach your capacity, before you are just absolutely not able to be any more resilient. You don't have any more resources. You have no more room to store this stuff. That's incredibly helpful.
Well, and I love what you said there about, people's perceptions on resiliency. And I think that we need to take a different angle at resiliency, because resiliency is not white-knuckling it until you get a chronic illness because your body just can't take it anymore, or you have to stop working because you got so burnt out and you didn't attune to yourself, or your marriage falls apart because you weren't dealing with issues there. That's not resiliency. The most resilient people are people who deal with their emotions, recognize that they need to refill their tank, and they continuously do that. And that's how they maintain, being resilient all throughout life, and they keep their marriage intact, and they move up in their career, and they keep their health strong. And I think oftentimes people think, well, if I have to reach out for help, then I'm weak. And I love kind of doing some work around that with clients to understand, what about that is weak? Just that you can't handle all of the problems life throws at you all by yourself, that makes you weak, and as people process that, they typically realize, oh, that's a really unrealistic standard. But then on top of that, reaching out for help is a vulnerable thing. And vulnerability is courageous. It is, the person who's afraid, and I don't ever want to call anyone weak, but, if we're going to do a comparison here, right? Like, it's stronger to be courageously vulnerable and reach out for help than it is to hide and act like you have it all together when things are mounding and mounding and mounding, and before you know it, something's going to slip. And it always does, because life is just kind of too much for everybody. And when people, when I talk about this with people, so often they think, well, being vulnerable is not courageous. Like, what about being vulnerable is courageous? And I think it's Brene Brown. This is like what she talks about. This is her thing. Yeah. And she asks people, can you think of a single courageous or heroic act that did not require vulnerability? Like firefighters jumping into a burning building. That's very vulnerable, They could get burned alive. People serving on the front lines for our country. That's very vulnerable. they could get shot and killed. And so with courage is vulnerability. They go together. And so being vulnerable is very courageous.
I agree. The first thing that came to mind when you were saying these things is usually, I think there's, physically being vulnerable, but also like when you have a friend that like opens up to you and shares, or even like in the news, if a celebrity says like, hey, I'm diagnosed with this, and they always seem to have the similar line of, I didn't want to talk about this, but I realized it could help other people. And so here I am sharing. And then you usually have this flood of, other people sharing and feeling empowered at that. But for some reason, I don't think people think that they can also be that impactful because maybe they don't have that big of a stage. But I know when friends have shared maybe surprising things or intimate things, like it usually brings people closer, and like they are no longer controlled by it as much. It doesn't wound them as much to talk about. But that's so helpful, and it resonates. It just makes me think of so many conversations I've had with friends and how much better the end result was just from deciding to be that vulnerable and take that step.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that comes up a lot with my clients is family influences. They're trying to be healthy. Family's still kind of, I say, programmed to like what your old habits, like if you've known them for 30 years, like they're used to the Allie that did this for 30 years. And now I'm changing on them and deciding, hey guys, I want to eat more salads or whatever it is. Right. I actually don't want to drink at the Christmas party. And they're like, whoa, you're changing things on me. How do you help set people up for success and kind of holding to those boundaries? Or I say like, you got to give your people time to like kind of reprogram to like your new set of habits. How do you help people in those types of scenarios?
From a therapeutic standpoint, come at it from a lot of different angles. A big one is self-esteem and having the self-assurance to set a boundary and be okay with the fact that lots of people are probably not going to like that. And you're probably going to face pushback, and you're going to hold firm anyways. Another big thing is teaching people what is the boundary, how do you set a boundary, and then how do you prepare for the fallout. And I think a lot of people don't even know what boundaries are. So a boundary is, and this comes from the book called Boundaries by Townsend and Cloud. And it's described as something that protects your emotional self, enhances the relationship, and is focused on self-control as opposed to other control. I'm trying to think of one in the context of food. I'll use one that is typically very applicable to couples. So, when you raise your voice at me, I will leave the room immediately. So that's focused on self-control. It's not saying, you're gonna this and that if you raise your voice at me. It's no, I'm gonna leave the room. And good ways to set boundaries as much as possible. So that actually wasn't a perfect example. And nonviolent communication avoids the use of you, which is why that was an imperfect example. Nonviolent communication, there's kind of like a formula to it. So it's when blank happens, I feel blank, and what I need from you is blank. So for instance, when voices are raised, I feel intimidated, and what I need from you is to keep your volume low. And then if you're going to set a boundary around it, it focuses on self-control. And so you can say, when voices are raised, you can add how you feel or you cannot. So you could say, I feel intimidated, and I'm going to leave the room immediately.
I liked one thing you said, the fallout of a boundary potentially being set or maybe working or not working, which I think is... how do you help clients with that? Do you kind of talk them through like what's the worst case scenario type things of like if you go to a party and now we're not drinking, your friends might add more peer pressure of like, come on, just have one or this or that, or like the scenarios of like what's the worst that can happen? They give you a little, crap for it and we move on. How do you help with, I like what you said, the fallout of dealing with people's reaction to your boundary?
I think a really important thing is making sure that you're prepared for that in terms of having support within your social network. So for instance, if you have just one friend and this friend means the world to you, you're going to have a really hard time setting boundaries with them, holding firm to those boundaries, and being able to tolerate the fallout. But if you're in that situation and you choose to make other connections so that you have other people to spend time with on the weekends and to share your problems with and all of that, you're going to have an easier time being able to then go and set a boundary with this friend because you don't lose everything in the fallout or risk losing everything. Another thing is getting emotional support from your network. So letting people know, I'm going to set this boundary. I'm nervous about it. And they can tell you you're not crazy for setting that boundary because that other person might try to make you feel crazy for setting that boundary, you know? And then recognizing that there might be some strain. There might be some pushback. There might be some distance. It may change how you relate. And that ultimately these things can be grown through and it can enhance your relationship, but it can feel awful for a little bit before it gets better. And so being prepared for that emotionally.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, don't invest all of your kind of friendship coins in one person versus having a support network of people that you can kind of lean on in different seasons of life as well. That makes a lot of sense. That's something I'm very passionate about when people are, again, just being careful of how people talk around food, because you don't know who's listening, whether it's around alcohol or if someone does have an eating disorder and like you've worked with a nutritionist and so this nutritionist said this food was bad, and it's like, that's why I'm so on people. Like, I know you didn't mean it, that was a bad food. Just be careful of like how we talk about food in front of your kids, in front of others, because they might pick up on that stuff and realize like, oh man, I had that yesterday. Am I a bad person because I ate this? And I think that's a way we can support people. So I think that's what we talked about a little bit last time of like, how can we support, or how the person as an individual can support themselves? How do we support loved ones? But also kind of on a society level of like, how do we support other people, other women, especially because diet culture is typically aimed very heavily at women and our looks, our aesthetics, and making sure we fit in this box versus like, especially I see a lot of this time of year. It doesn't look like summer outside, but it is June. It's raining cats and dogs out. But I see so much about like getting a bikini body and like all this kind of stuff versus like, let's take that pressure off and like enjoy the summer. If you want to feel healthier, great. What are some other things that we can kind of do to support peers, whether we know they're going through something or not?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with each of us. I think it starts with loving your own body. You know, instead of planning out your workout routine so you can have the perfect bikini body, why don't you plan your summer around things that you actually enjoy? You know, instead of focusing on a particular aesthetic for your workouts, why don't you focus on getting strong, on getting healthy, on making your body as resilient to age as possible. I think it really matters how we speak about ourselves and about others, and remaining non-judgmental, you know, accepting different body types, and not making like assumptions that one body type is more beautiful than another, because we have a wide variety of body types, and beauty is personal preference, and so who are we to say that one is more beautiful than another? And I think we also really need to speak out against our cultural pressure that like the women are nothing but their bodies. You know, there's a huge emphasis on our physical selves instead of our mental, emotional, spiritual, relational selves. And we as women, we're complex, we're amazing and capable of so much. And when we're boiled down to our bodies or even specific body parts, it's really objectifying. And studies show that women actually internalize this objectification, view themselves in this way, and then view other women in that way. And so we actually perpetuate the cycle in our own lives, in our daughters' lives, on and on. And so remembering that we're more than our bodies, we're more than our sexualities, we're more than, who we are to other people, that we are important as individuals separate from all of that.
That's so powerful, and it makes me it seems ironic, but it makes me think about when I talk to somebody for the first time and they're kind of, because one of the first questions I'll ask is like, what are your health goals? And I always try to say health goals again, I never want to assume, and not everybody has like weight loss goals, but I do find that some women are hesitant in some ways. Some are too eager, I feel like, and some are too hesitant to say, like, I would like to lose weight. Some people solely focus on that, and then I feel like the foundation isn't very strong because they're only connected to the scale. And so when that doesn't go well, like, everything crumbles and they don't want to do it. And sometimes it's the opposite of women. I know, like, I feel like secretly they have some sort of body composition component that I would like to know, just so I know what the full list and image that the image of their like goals, right? The vision that of their healthy lifestyle that they're trying to create. And so it feels like a very delicate conversation when I want to support women of like, if you want to lose weight, that's fine. That's up to you. You can do that. But also not making that the sole goal, because I don't find that's ever really successful too, unless someone is truly like lab work looks great, mental health sounds like they're just in a great spot with their family and all of the things, then sure, maybe it's just about weight loss. Usually I don't attract those people. Usually it's a little bit more of a health, holistic thing. How would you help probably a woman in this scenario, but someone kind of come to terms and really create like a good foundation of like, okay, I do maybe want to lose weight. I don't want to make it all about that. I want to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons, because I'm always kind of checking, like, is there any component of an eating disorder? Are you doing this for, quote, like very healthy reasons holistically? What would that maybe conversation sound like if you were helping a woman kind of determine that?
Yeah, well, I do think getting really clear about why you're wanting to lose weight is important. Did you get lab results that scared you? Okay, that's one thing. Is it because you hate your body and can't stand to look at yourself in the mirror? Okay, that's another thing. And I think it's really important for us to have compassion and love our bodies at different weights and shapes and sizes. And I think if you're looking to weight loss to give you a sense of self, to give you self-confidence and identity, you're not going to find it there. It can help, if you feel confident in your body, that can help, certainly. But it's not going to. I mean, some of the fittest, slimmest, trimmest people are the most insecure. And so being aware of that is important. And I think also if you are feeling like a lot of anxiety around weight loss or your weight and the lack of weight loss, or around food and calories and exercising, that's a pretty good indication that there may be more going on, unless that is, hey, I just got diagnosed with, type 2 diabetes and I have anxiety around that. Okay, that's one thing. But anxiety because you ate 100 more calories than you had intended that day, and now the whole day is ruined. There's something deeper going on.
Absolutely. That's a great way to paint it. I love those examples. Very, very clear of like, okay, this is maybe not the healthiest thought. Maybe we want to back up a little bit and make sure we're doing this for reasons that really matter summer season or whatever. I think that's very unique. Because a lot of people that I feel like I attract, and I think you might be similar, usually it's a person that's fairly proactive, right? When I have to reach out to someone versus someone is referred by a PCP, that's great. But usually, if the person themselves, the patient themselves, client reaches out themselves, they're generally pretty proactive. They want tools of like, how do I solve this? Kind of a problem solver and a go-getter. And so having those other things that they can do outside of talking to us, I feel like is so helpful, because they're like, okay, I can't, our time is limited. I have check-in calls 20 to 30 minutes a week, and clients are welcome to message me, but there's a slower turnaround with that, right? Versus if like we talk about and like, okay, if I'm feeling like this, like walking makes me help better, I can go take advantage of a walk, or this supplement helps with this that I'm experiencing. Having those tools that are outside of our one-on-one talking time, I think, are just so incredibly helpful. And I think people are looking for those type of providers. And I've heard several clients of like, who's the PCP, who's the clinic that you recommend working with? Because if you like them, if they're if you're holistic and they're holistic, usually they're more inclined to reach out with those people. And sometimes that's really hard to find in the insurance world. And quite often that's when clients are going to like a private practice PT or a masseuse that doesn't take insurance, potentially, because they want to work with those people that will help them solve those problems a little bit more proactively. So I feel like that's a very, very unique approach.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, people want to find something that is going to work quickly. And so kind of the way I think about it is the things that are going to work the most quickly are your coping skills. And that's not going to solve your problem, but it's going to help you to deal with your problem. And then these integrative approaches are kind of shorter term, but, longer term than coping skills. If you can get yourself metabolically well and getting other supports around you, then you're going to progress more quickly. And then the longer term, really transformational work is dealing with the underlying issues, the trauma, the family dynamics, the self-esteem, your self-concept and self-image, those sorts of things. And so if we can utilize all of that, what's really helpful is we can start to help people to feel better faster, and then do the deeper work to make that a lifelong thing.
Absolutely. Everything you kind of mentioned really kind of comes full circle as far as like labeling the emotions of what I'm dealing with. I mean, that came straight to mind when I was thinking of myself, of like, I was really sad, I was really lonely, and that's why I was leaning on food, and not dealing with emotions. Definitely not dealing with them to completion by any means. And my cup probably overspilled, and it overspilled at every mealtime when I had to have that extra pressure of figuring out what to eat or trying to make myself not overeat. But again, if I can look at it and maybe, improve all of my like maybe 10 problems, 10 small things, and improve that 10%, each little thing just gets 10% better. That helps the overall equation so much. I would imagine give people a lot of hope of like, oh, I can tackle this thing, even though this thing feels like a really big thing to tackle. I can tackle it in little amounts, where I feel like I actually can, versus just kind of staring the beast in the face and be like, hopefully you go away, this whatever bad habit or thing they're dealing with.
Right. Absolutely.
So a couple closing questions. The first one is kind of to summarize, what advice would you give someone that is embarking, potentially restarting, but embarking on a health journey, whether it's for the first time or the 50th? What would you say to them to hopefully make this their last campaign, their last attempt before they really just become a healthier version of themselves?
One is, try to get really clear about why you're doing it. If you're doing it for healthy reasons, that clarity is going to help to propel you and keep you progressing when things get hard. If you're doing it for unhealthy reasons, then having that clarity is going to help to point you in the right direction to deal with those things, and then find what it really is that you're looking for. Instead of chasing this endless, trying to find fulfillment where you won't find it, and constantly chasing. Um, and then another thing is reach out for help. There are so many people who can support you with this, from nutrition coaches, dietitians, therapists, doctors. And I think an integrated approach is the best when you have multiple professionals. If you're able to do that, supporting you all at once, then you have the greatest chance at success and being truly healthy and well.
Absolutely. So beautifully put. And then lastly, this has become one of my favorite questions, but in a culture society that makes it very easy to be healthy, that's very normal, very common, what would you like to normalize to help the whole population get healthier?
I know I said this in our last recording too, but I'll say the same thing, and that's really learning to just be, because we are a culture that is extremely focused on doing, on productivity. And I think that takes away from us in many ways. It takes away from our ability to rest, to rejuvenate ourselves, which wears us out, burns us out, harms our physical health, harms our mental health, harms our relational health, makes us creative, and consequently less productive too, actually. And being is not just not being productive for the moment either. It's also being fully present. And I think we really struggle with that, with being on our phones, being on our devices. And I think the more that we can be present, the more we're going to soak up the things in life that matter, the more that we're going to connect with the people who matter, and the healthier we're going to be.
Absolutely. I think it helps us kind of shift priorities and make things, like you said, clarity seems to be a really common theme. And clarity, awareness, like if we can get clear of what we actually want instead of trying to put a lot of Band-Aids on things, I think that's very hard. And I mean, yeah, it's hard to, I think that's the default, especially as women, to be like, okay, I don't have to do anything right now. What can I get done is like the first thought, versus I feel like men are better than this. This might be a generalization, but like a little bit more okay with being, versus my default is kind of like, okay, what should I be doing? Like I have this time, I should be doing something, versus taking time to rest feels very like, no, surely I should be doing something else.
Yeah, like we have to account for every minute of our day. We have to give a report to our non-existent boss in our personal life, because every minute must be accounted for.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful, Mariah. Thank you so much for taking the time. If people want to reach out and learn more about your services, where's the best place for them to find you or learn more?
Yeah, you can find our website, sedecounseling.org. I also have my Psychology Today. It's just Mariah Sede. You can find me on there. And then we have social media that's run by my husband, but we're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Yeah, a few different platforms.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure all of that is linked in the show notes so people can reach out. But thanks so much for taking the time, and I'm sure maybe we'll have a part 2 down the line, because this has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much for listening to that episode. I hope you found it as insightful and helpful as I did. First of all, if you're watching this on Spotify or YouTube, please like this video, share it with a friend, follow or subscribe on YouTube, leave a comment. All of that helps us really grow the show and reach more people. Very, very helpful. Lastly is to subscribe to the email list. That is Free Shit Friday email list. You can subscribe at parksidenutrition.com/subscribe. That way you never miss a free resource that goes out every Friday. Usually it includes the newest podcast, the latest YouTube, where I teach you how to eat out and do it in a slightly healthier way, plus some sort of PDF download for you to download, use, whether it's a recipe, meal plan examples, things like that. And lastly, please go check out Mariah and her resources. I'll link them in the show notes below. Sede Counseling. You can find them on LinkedIn, Facebook. And make sure you get on their email list if they have one. And I will hopefully see you in the next episode.